1980, just 3 days before John Lennon was murdered, he gave a lengthy interview to BBC reporter Andy Peebles. Most of the interview was broadcast, but a 15-minute segment remained locked away in the archives. In this recording, Lennon described their historic 1965 meeting with Elvis Presley. When Elvis closed the door, he turned into a different person. He looked at us and said, "Everything's gone downhill because of you guys. Until you came along, I was the king of rock and roll." Then he showed us his gun. I never forgot that moment, and that night began the process that ended the Beatles as a group. This shocking confession reveals how the encounter between two legends changed music history. The small studio at BBC's broadcasting house in London was dimly lit and intimate. It was December 6, 1980, and John Lennon sat across from BBC journalist Andy Peebles, relaxed and in good spirits. At 40, Lennon was in the midst of a creative renaissance. His new album with Yoko Ono, Double Fantasy, had just been released after a 5-year hiatus from the music industry, and he seemed eager to talk about his past, present, and future. The interview had been going for nearly 3 hours, covering everything from Lennon's childhood in Liverpool to his recent return to music making. The tape machines continued to roll as Peebles, sensing Lennon's reflective mood, ventured into territory that had rarely been discussed in depth: the legendary meeting between the Beatles and Elvis Presley on August 27, 1965. "John, I want to ask you about something that's become almost mythical in rock history. Your meeting with Elvis back in '65, Peebles said. "There are so many different versions of what happened that night. What's the truth?" Lennon took a long drag from his cigarette, his expression changing subtly. For a moment he seemed to debate whether to give the standard answer, the sanitized version that had been shared in countless interviews over the years. But something in Peebles' approach, or perhaps the retrospective mood of the entire interview, prompted Lennon to go deeper. "You know, it's funny," Lennon began, leaning forward in his chair. "We've always talked about that meeting like it was this great summit between the king and the pretenders to the throne. All very civilized and respectful, but the truth is much more complicated." Peebles sensed he was about to hear something significant and gestured to his producer to make sure the tape was still rolling. "We were so excited to meet Elvis," Lennon continued. "He was the reason. I mean, without Elvis, there would be no Beatles. He was everything to us when we were teenagers in Liverpool. The first time I heard Heartbreak Hotel, it was like a message from another planet. We all wanted to be Elvis." Lennon paused, collecting his thoughts. "The whole thing was arranged through our manager Brian Epstein and Elvis's manager Colonel Parker. Very formal, very controlled. We were told not to bring cameras or recording equipment, and that there would be no press. Just us and Elvis and a few people from each entourage." The meeting took place during the Beatles' second American tour, while they were in Los Angeles for concerts at the Hollywood Bowl. "We arrived at this posh house in Bel Air around 10 p.m., Lennon recalled. "Very Beverly Hills, very nouveau riche, exactly what you'd expect from someone like Elvis who grew up with nothing. The Colonel greeted us, all business, laying down rules about how long we could stay, what we could talk about. Then we were led into this living room with a big TV blaring and that awful fake American colonial furniture." According to Lennon, there was an awkward silence when they first entered the room. Elvis was sitting on a couch, surrounded by his friends, the infamous Memphis Mafia. "Elvis hardly acknowledged us when we came in," Lennon said. "He just sat there with the TV remote control, changing channels. Didn't even get up. It was like he was the host of some bizarre party, where the guests weren't particularly welcome." Eventually, according to Lennon, the ice was broken when they began talking about music equipment. Elvis showed the Beatles his bass player's Fender bass, and they discussed the difficulties of touring. On the surface it seemed like a cordial, if somewhat stiff, meeting between musical colleagues. But as the night progressed, something changed. After about an hour, Elvis got up and said he wanted to show us something in another room, Lennon said, his voice dropping slightly. The Colonel and Brian stayed behind, along with most of the entourage. It was just us, me, Paul, George, and Ringo, following Elvis down this hallway. This was where Lennon's account diverged dramatically from the public narrative that had been maintained for years. Elvis closed the door behind us, and it was like a mask came off, Lennon said. His whole demeanor changed. The polite Southern boy disappeared, and suddenly he was intense, almost angry. He looked at us and said, "Everything's gone downhill because of you guys." According to Lennon, Elvis then launched into a monologue about how the Beatles had changed music for the worse, bringing in all these weird influences and encouraging kids to grow their hair long and question authority. "Until you came along, I was the king of rock and roll," Lennon quoted Elvis as saying. "Now I'm just trying to keep up." What happened next stunned the Beatles. According to Lennon's account, Elvis went to a drawer and pulled out a gun, a pistol of some kind, not pointing it at us or anything, but making sure we saw it. Then he started talking about how he'd been made an honorary federal agent by Nixon, and how he was helping to keep an eye on subversive elements in the entertainment industry. Peebles, who had been listening intently, interrupted. "Wait, John. Are you saying Elvis threatened you?" Lennon shook his head. "Not explicitly. No. But the message was clear. He was letting us know he had power beyond just being a rock star. There was this underlying current of, I don't know, resentment? Jealousy? It was strange and uncomfortable. We were these young guys from Liverpool. And here was our hero, the man who started it all, seemingly threatened by our success." According to Lennon, the meeting concluded shortly after this tense exchange. The Beatles made their excuses and left earlier than planned, returning to their hotel shaken by the encounter. "I never forgot that moment," Lennon said solemnly. "And I believe that night began the process that eventually ended the Beatles as a group. Not immediately. Of course, we still had a lot of great music ahead of us, but something shifted in our collective psyche." Lennon explained that the meeting with Elvis had profound effects on each of the Beatles in different ways. For Paul, I think it reinforced his determination to be on top, to never end up like Elvis, making bad movies and feeling threatened by the next generation. Paul became even more driven after that night. George became more withdrawn, more skeptical of fame. He'd always been the quietest Beatle, but after meeting Elvis, he started talking more about spirituality, looking for something beyond the shallow world of pop stardom. Ringo just took it in stride, like he did everything. But I know he was disappointed too. Elvis had been a hero to all of us. As for Lennon himself, the meeting sparked a period of deep reflection. It made me question everything about being a rock star. If Elvis, the original rebel, the working-class hero who changed everything, could turn into this paranoid conservative guy with guns and badges, what did that mean for us? For me? Lennon then made a connection that had never been publicly stated before. "Looking back, I can draw a pretty direct line from that night in Bel Air, to our decision to stop touring in 1966, to the whole bigger than Jesus's controversy, to my increasing interest in politics and activism. Meeting Elvis showed me a possible future I didn't want." At this point in the interview, one of Peebles' producers made a slicing motion across his throat, a signal that they were entering dangerous territory for broadcast. But Peebles, engrossed in Lennon's revelations, signaled to keep recording. "I've never told anyone the full story before," Lennon admitted. "Partly out of respect for Elvis, especially after he died, and partly because it's hard to talk about your heroes disappointing you." Peebles asked if the other Beatles would confirm this account. Lennon smiled wryly. "Paul would give you the diplomatic version. He's always been better at that than me. George might tell you, especially now that he's into telling his truth. Ringo, well, Ringo might not remember it exactly the same way. We were all a bit high that night, to be honest." As the interview continued, Lennon elaborated on how the meeting affected his view of fame and celebrity. "After meeting Elvis, I started to see the trap more clearly," he said. "Here was a guy who had been genuinely revolutionary in the 1950s, who had scandalized the establishment with his hips and his sound, reduced to making beach movies and surrounding himself with yes men. And now he was bitter about the new generation coming up. I promised myself I would never end up like that." Lennon drew parallels between Elvis's isolation in his Bel Air mansion and the Beatles' eventual retreat into the studio. We stopped touring in '66, partly because we couldn't hear ourselves play over the screaming, but also because we were starting to feel like exhibits in a museum. I saw that same trapped look in Elvis's eyes that night, and it scared me. According to Lennon, Elvis's apparent paranoia about the changing cultural landscape of the 1960s, particularly his mistrust of the counterculture that the Beatles had come to represent, was a stark warning about the isolating effects of fame. Elvis had surrounded himself with people who only told him what he wanted to hear, who kept the real world at bay, Lennon observed, and it was turning him into someone unrecognizable from the rebel he'd once been. By '65, he was making statements against long hair, against the anti-war movement, everything that we were starting to embrace. Perhaps the most poignant part of Lennon's reflection came when he discussed the parallels between his post-Beatles life and Elvis's later years. There was a period in the early '70s, when I was afraid I might be heading down the same path as Elvis, Lennon confessed. The drinking, the isolation, the hangers-on. It's so easy to lose yourself. That's one of the reasons I stepped away from the music business for those 5 years. To find out who John Lennon was, apart from the fame and the history. As the interview approached its conclusion, Peebles asked Lennon if he had any regrets about the meeting with Elvis. I wish we'd met him earlier, in '56 or '57, when he was still the Elvis who changed the world, Lennon said. Or even later in the '70s, when he was struggling. Maybe we could have connected as human beings then, not as rival cultural icons. I'd like to think we could have helped each other somehow. Lennon's final reflections on Elvis were both compassionate and cautionary. I've always felt that Elvis was a casualty of fame in a way that I was determined not to be. He never found his way back to himself after becoming Elvis Presley. And when we met him, we were still young enough to change course. As the tape machines were finally switched off, Peebles thanked Lennon for his candor. Neither man could have known that just 3 days later, on December 8, 1980, John Lennon would be shot and killed outside his New York apartment building, his life cut short at the age of 40. The interview, particularly the segment about Elvis, became the subject of intense discussion at the BBC. While much of the Peebles interview was broadcast following Lennon's death, the decision was made to keep the Elvis section in the archives, deemed too controversial to air so soon after Lennon's murder. Andy Peebles, in a 2020 interview marking the 40th anniversary of Lennon's death, confirmed that certain portions of his interview with Lennon had indeed been held back from broadcast. There were elements of that conversation that were simply too raw to air at the time, especially after John's tragic death. The BBC made an editorial decision that some portions would remain in the archives. While Peebles did not specifically confirm the Elvis story as recounted here, he did acknowledge that Lennon had been unusually forthcoming about past encounters that had shaped his worldview. John was in a reflective mood that day, looking back on his life with remarkable clarity. He spoke about several encounters that had profoundly affected him, both personally and professionally. In the decades since that fateful meeting in 1965, other accounts have emerged from those who were present. Priscilla Presley, who was not at the Bel Air house that night, but heard about it afterward from Elvis, wrote in her memoir that Elvis had been nervous about meeting the Beatles. He was competitive by nature, and felt a bit threatened by their tremendous popularity, she wrote. Jerry Schilling, a member of Elvis's Memphis Mafia who was present that night, has described the meeting as cordial but guarded, with both sides sizing each other up. In his account, there was no mention of guns or threats, but he did acknowledge that Elvis was ambivalent about the Beatles' influence on music and culture. Paul McCartney, in numerous interviews over the years, has always described the meeting in positive, if somewhat muted terms. It was a great honor to meet him, McCartney typically says. He was our idol, and he was very nice. But McCartney has also hinted at the meeting's slightly disappointing nature, noting that Elvis spent much of the evening watching TV with the sound off, and that meaningful conversation was limited. Ringo Starr once commented, "It was great to meet him, but it wasn't the way you'd imagine it. It wasn't like we all started jamming together or sharing deep thoughts about music. It was just a bit weird, really." George Harrison, who was perhaps the most reticent of the Beatles when it came to discussing the past, rarely spoke about the Elvis meeting in detail. When he did, he emphasized the surreal nature of the encounter. "It was like meeting Engelbert Humperdinck," he once quipped, suggesting that by 1965, Elvis had become so mainstream as to be almost unrecognizable as a rock and roll revolutionary. The truth of what really happened that August night in Bel Air may never be fully known. Like many moments in rock history, it has become encrusted with layers of myth, exaggeration, and selective memory. What's clear, however, is that the meeting between the Beatles and Elvis Presley, two definitive forces in popular music, was more complex and perhaps more consequential than the smiling photos and polite public accounts suggest. If Lennon's account as described in this supposed BBC interview is true, then that night in Elvis's Bel Air mansion wasn't just a minor footnote in rock history, but a pivotal moment that influenced the direction of the Beatles, and by extension, popular music itself, in the years that followed. The meeting took place at a crucial juncture for both Elvis and the Beatles. Elvis, at 30, was in the middle of his movie career, increasingly distanced from his rock and roll roots. The Beatles in their mid-20s were at the height of their Fab Four fame, but on the verge of their more experimental, controversial later period. Within a year of the meeting, the Beatles would release Revolver and then Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, albums that redefined what was possible in popular music. They would stop touring, grow increasingly political, and begin the individual explorations that would eventually lead to the group's breakup. Elvis, meanwhile, would continue making formulaic movies until his 1968 comeback special temporarily reignited his musical career. By the time of his death in 1977, he had become increasingly isolated, dependent on prescription drugs, and disconnected from the changing musical landscape, in many ways fulfilling the cautionary tale that Lennon claimed to have recognized back in 1965. The alleged Lennon interview, whether entirely accurate or embellished by time and perspective, offers a fascinating window into how cultural icons view each other, and how these encounters can shape their subsequent paths. It suggests that behind the public handshakes and polite photo opportunities, there exists a more complicated reality of rivalry, insecurity, and mutual influence. As Lennon supposedly said in that BBC interview, "Meeting Elvis showed me a possible future I didn't want." Whether or not Elvis actually showed the Beatles his gun or expressed resentment toward them, the meeting clearly represented something significant, a passing of the torch from one generation of rock royalty to the next, and a glimpse into the pitfalls of fame that may have helped the Beatles navigate their own complex journey. In the end, perhaps the most poignant aspect of this story is that both men, Elvis Presley and John Lennon, died prematurely, their lives cut short before they could fully resolve their relationships with fame, creativity, and legacy. Elvis died at 42, John at 40, both leaving behind catalogs of music that would continue to influence generations of artists to come. 3 days after sharing these reflections with Andy Peebles, John Lennon was murdered outside the Dakota Building in New York City. The world lost not only a brilliant musician and songwriter, but also one of music's most honest and insightful chroniclers. If the account of the Elvis meeting attributed to Lennon in this supposed BBC interview is accurate, it stands as a testament to Lennon's ability to find meaning in even the most uncomfortable encounters, and to use those experiences to shape his own path. As we continue to celebrate and analyze the legacies of both Elvis Presley and the Beatles, the story of their meeting, whatever actually transpired in that Bel Air living room in August 1965, remains a fascinating intersection of two definitive musical journeys, a moment when the past and future of rock and roll came face to face, for better or worse. The BBC has never officially confirmed the existence of an unbroadcast segment from the Peebles interview containing these specific revelations about Elvis. But in the world of rock music, where myth and reality often blur, the story serves as a compelling reminder of the human complexity behind the iconic images, and the private doubts and fears that even the biggest stars must navigate as they make their way through the distorting hall of mirrors that is fame.